Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast. The P.A.S. Report provides an honest analysis on the critical issues that matter to you without the biased media filters. Here's your host, Professor Nicholas Giordano.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Podcast. Here's your host, Nick Giordano. I hope everyone had a great weekend out there. And the obvious elephant in the room is former President Trump. We have reports surfacing that the former president's going to be charged this week. Even he himself has stated that he's likely to be charged on Tuesday. Apparently, they're going to move to charge him with campaign violations for the hush money he paid to porn star Stormy Daniels. If any of you believe this is about hush money payments, you're crazy. If you think this is about former President Trump and a porn star, you are being naive. There is much more than meets the eye here. It goes far beyond the money, beyond the porn star, even beyond Trump to a lesser degree. And it should have every single one of us concerned. What's going on is absolute insanity. It's the banana republic that we've been trending towards for quite some time. But I'm not going to get into the details now. And trust me, you're going to want to hear my analysis because it really speaks to the environment that we're living in. But I'm going to discuss the reasoning behind it as well as the ramifications on Wednesday's episode. It's going to be an explosive episode. You're going to make sure you want to tune in. For today, I am bringing in James Rosen. James is the senior correspondent, White House correspondent for Newsmax. He's the author of a brand new book, Scalia, Rise to Greatness. Now, this is a phenomenal book, and I was honored to get an advance copy to read through. When you look at Justice Scalia, man, he led such a remarkable life. When it comes to Italian Americans, Justice Scalia is someone you could really admire. He's not like the Cuomos or the Faucis for Italian Americans. We disown them. We trade them somewhere else. Justice Scalia is someone that really, he lived a fascinating life. And as part of my job, I read a lot of biographies out there. Most biographies, a lot of them are dry. They're okay. They provide, obviously important information, but they always lack a certain amount of specificity. And when I say that, when I say they lack detail, when I'm reading about someone, I want to know what makes them tick. I want to know what their life experiences were that shaped their behavior, that shaped the way they make decisions when they're in positions of power. And I have to say, James did a great job with this one. It's one of the most detailed accounts I've ever read, and it's almost like when you're reading it, you know Scalia personally. That's what makes it so amazing. It really delves into his experiences that shaped him in his career before he got to the Supreme Court. And I want to talk to James about that. I also want to talk to him about what it's like being in the White House press room, because that also has to be fun. Before I bring on James, make sure you go to the PAS Report website, subscribe to the PAS Report newsletter, click follow or subscribe on the podcast, depending on the podcast platform that you're listening on, and share this episode with your family and friends. With that airway, I want to welcome James Rosen, senior White House correspondent for Newsmax, author of the brand new book, Scalia, Rise to Greatness. James, great to have you on the program. How are you today?
Nick, blessed to be with you. Thanks for having me.
I'm glad to have you on because I found this book fascinating. And then reading what it took to actually write the book was interesting as well. This was 5 years in the making. So as an academic, I have to ask, how did you have that patience to take it to 5 years to do such thorough research to get the book done?
Well, for me, it was a labor of love. I think the person who really showed extraordinary patience was Mrs. Rosen, who was not pleased, I will say, by the decision to extend this from what started out as a concise biography of Antonin Scalia and then became a mammoth 2-volume work, and which resulted in a 2-year extension on Justice Scalia's lease on the Rosens' lives. But I knew Justice Scalia a little bit. I was blessed to have met him. When I first came to Washington to be a reporter back in 1999, and I was 30, one of the first things I did was write to Justice Scalia to seek an interview with him. And this commenced a very unusual and at times amusing correspondence between us, which went on for about 2 years, and also included a pair of one-on-one lunches together at his favorite place, the AV Ristorante Italiano, now long defunct on New York Avenue, a fairly modest Italian restaurant that had been his go-to place since the 1950s. And we drank wine together. He asked me to eat off of his plate. I was like, Mr. Justice, I can't.
That's an Italian thing.
And there I am shoveling like vegetables off of Justice Scalia's plate into my mouth. He drove me back to my office in his car both times. And that was an interesting experience. So he was so generous to a young reporter back then that I resolved that one day I would write about him. The contents of our lunches, the actual substantive discussions we had, will remain off the record as they were at the time. But I will publish from some of that correspondence in Volume 2, which will cover the Supreme Court years. This book, Scalia: Rise to Greatness, tells the story of the first 50 years of Antonin Scalia's life. It ends with him taking his seat on the Supreme Court.
And with that in mind, when we look at the Supreme Court justices, we see them in their black robes and they all look stuffy. But Justice Scalia was different. He had a personality to him throughout his lifetime. Can you explain to the audience what his personality was like?
I begin the whole book with an excerpt from an interview that I conducted with Meg Scalia Bryce, who is the youngest of the Scalia's 9 children. And in this little snippet that's published right at the very front of the book, before you read anything else, this was conducted in 2017, about a year plus after her father had died. And she said to me, after his death, when people said that he was larger than life, he was. And he was that way to us as well. And then the transcript says Rosen. And he was cognizant that he was that way, right? And Meg Scalia Bryce said, oh, yes. Oh, yeah. He was putting on a show, but it was a great show. And that's the type of person he was. He was liable with shameless but endearing grandeur to commandeer somebody's piano in their house and start belting out show tunes and Christmas carols for 50 people. He was a great wit. And that's why he was able to cultivate relationships across the ideological divide with other justices like Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
And I always found that fascinating as well, because if you look at Ruth Bader Ginsburg, you look at Justice Scalia, they are of a different ideological mindset, but she really took a liking to him when he came to the court and befriended him. And that friendship blossomed into a real relationship, a working relationship and a personal relationship. How do you think that helped the court?
Well, because when you have these 9 justices operating in essence like 9 small little law firms independently of one another and not even really engaging with each other that much, when you have at least 2 of the justices who are on opposite sides of most jurisprudential questions, it can only help that they would attack ideas but not each other. And in this famous friendship between Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Antonin Scalia, where they went to the opera together, they rang in New Year's every year together, they rode elephants in India together, this book, Scalia: Rise to Greatness, marks the first time we can actually witness in real time the birth and the blossoming of that friendship, because I was the first researcher to go through Ruth Bader Ginsburg's 220 plus boxes at the Library of Congress. And when she and Antonin Scalia first met, it was not on the Supreme Court. It was one rung below the Supreme Court, which is called the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit, often described as the second most powerful court in America. And Ginsburg and Scalia were judges there together from 1982 to 86 before each of them in turn moved on to the Supreme Court. And in the handwritten notes and the memos and the letters and the correspondence and the draft opinions that flew back and forth between the chambers of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Antonin Scalia in the mid-'80s when they were both appellate judges. I'm the first researcher to publish these documents. I call them the RBG Nino papers. Mm-hmm. And not only are they brilliant expositions of law and logic by 2 obvious geniuses on the First Amendment and other issues before them, they capture their sparkling wit, but really they capture the birth and, as I say, the blossoming of this famous friendship in real time. It's the first time these documents have ever been published. And
your book, I have to say, it's like the definitive guide to Scalia. That's what that's the main takeaway. It's something that you're not going to see in other books when it comes to Scalia. But
can I amplify on that point just real quick, Nick?
You certainly can.
What I found was that the previous 2 biographies of Antonin Scalia that were both published before he died, one of them he cooperated with extensively, the other not at all. And they both turned out pretty much the same, which is to say fairly open in their contempt for Justice Scalia and his jurisprudence and his legacy and his conduct. So in addition to being the first biography of Justice Scalia published since his death, and the most comprehensive, treating whole very important passages in his first 50 years before he went to the Supreme Court, where he worked for the Nixon and Ford administrations and had a huge impact on American life in those positions, and then his academic positions at UVA and University of Chicago Law Schools. A lot of this was treated very cursorily in the previous biographies, and in almost all cases, those biographers hostile to Justice Scalia interpreted just about every episode and phase of his life and career in the most tendentious terms. So this is the most comprehensive biography of Justice Scalia, splitting it up into two portions, his pre-court life and then Volume 2 later will be his Supreme Court years. I say that it is the first accurate biography of Antonin Scalia precisely because it's the first admiring biography of him.
Yeah, and I think it's important because as a political scientist, one of the tools that we use is the individual levels of analysis, that you need to understand why a person makes the decisions that they do. And I think your biography gets at that. You know, when we talk about his rise to greatness, you're talking about the factors that actually influenced him throughout his life to make him the man that he was. What was something that really stood out to you, that surprised you, maybe that you weren't expecting when you were doing the research?
The degree of rejection that Antonin Scalia faced, even though he was valedictorian several times in his career and was just a stellar student and young man, at times he faced rejection. He was not one to wallow in identity politics, and he certainly would never, for any purposes, at any point in his life, have identified himself as a victim of any kind. But he did say that he felt anti-Italian prejudice was in the room when he interviewed as valedictorian from his high school to apply at Princeton. And he was rejected from Princeton. And it turns out, I'm talking about some of the many documents that are in Scalia Rise to Greatness that have never appeared anywhere before, like the RBG Nino papers. One of those, of which I'm proudest, is that in 1992, in his chambers at the Supreme Court, his seventh term on the court, Justice Scalia conducted a secret oral history looking back on his life to that point. And it had never been unsealed until 2018. So this is the first biography to make use of it. And he tells his interviewer, who was a female attorney that he had known for many years, who conducted the oral history, about this episode at Princeton when he was rejected. And he said that he got the sense that his interviewers, the Princeton alumni, took a look at him and determined that he wasn't the Princeton sort. And when the oral history interviewer asked, what does that mean, not the Princeton sort? And he said, not waspy enough, didn't belong to the right clubs, etc. In the end, he went to Georgetown University, the second consecutive Jesuit institution he had attended, was valedictorian there as well, and from there went to Harvard Law School, thereby showing the folks at Princeton.
And now that you brought it up, you know, when we look at his Jesuit schooling and you look at his Roman Catholic faith, that was very influential in his life and even in his rulings, we could later see.
Well, for sure, it was one of the true propellants in his life was his deep and abiding Catholic faith. Of course, that came to him through his parents. And Scalia really is, to many, the embodiment of the American dream because his father came to the United States from Italy in 1920 with only $400 in his pocket and not knowing English, and made of himself a Romance languages professor renowned in his field. Scalia's mother was herself the daughter of Italian immigrants, and she became a school teacher. And from those three powerful forces, the Catholic Church and its liturgy, the influence of his father, who actually lectured professionally on the perils of translation or interpretation of a text when it was converted from one language to another, and his mother, who was, of course, a grammarian, and also venerated the classics. Scalia emerged from all of this with a profound reverence for the original meaning of text. That text was never to be monkeyed with in translation or interpretation. As Father Paul Scalia, who, of course, is one of the justice's children and who was interviewed for this book, as he said at one of the memorial services for his father, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And Scalia was very careful never to inject his Catholicism into his rulings. His rulings were supposed to be according to the original meaning of the law and the text of the law. He would say that there's no such thing as a Catholic hamburger, but he would add with that twinkle in his eye, he would add that the closest we could come to a Catholic hamburger would be a hamburger that had been made perfectly.
As someone who worked in emergency management, I routinely sounded the alarm bells on our outdated grid system. Think back to 2003 when a tree branch hit a power line in Ohio, shutting down power to the entire eastern seaboard. Around 100 people died, and this was one of the costliest disasters in American history, with losses totaling over $60 billion. Even the White House sees it. They're saying 2/3 of the grid are at least 25 years old, and they recently announced billions of dollars to update it. But we're talking about the government here. How long do you think that's going to take, if at all? When an incident happens, you have to rely on yourself. Be prepared for yourself and your family. With the Patriot Power Generator, you get a solar generator that doesn't install into your house because because it's portable. You can take it with you, even use it inside. But it's powerful enough for your phones, medical devices, and even your fridge. Right now, you can go to 4patriots.com, use code P.A.S. to get 10% off your first purchase on anything in the store, including the Patriot Power Generator. You'll also get their famous guarantee for an entire year after your order, plus free shipping on orders over $97. A portion of every sale is donated to charities who support veterans and their families. Just go to 4patriots.com, use code PAS to get 10% off. That's 4patriots.com, use code PAS to get yours today. Welcome back, everyone. And James, now I want to talk about originalism versus judicial activism, because we see the arguments today. Should the Supreme Court justice, should they be originalist, should they be textualist, or should they engage in judicial activism, where they see the Constitution as old and outdated? Obviously, Scalia sided with the idea of originalism and textualism. Can you explain the difference between originalism and textualism?
Yes, certainly. So before Scalia came along, what prevailed in legal circles was this liberal notion of a living constitution, the idea that the Constitution is a living, breathing document that can expand almost accordion-like or like an organism in order to account for new phenomena that the founding fathers never could have envisioned, such as nuclear weapons or the internet. And in order to breathe that life into the Constitution, liberal judges and justices would look beyond the mere text of the law and look instead to legislative intent. What was said in all those debates on the House and Senate floor? What was said in those committee reports that were generated as a bill snaked its way through the process? Scalia stood athwart all of that, Nick. He argued on behalf of the idea that judges and justices, when they're engaged in their central business, which is to interpret the meaning of a constitutional provision or a statute that's been passed at any point since the Constitution, their job is not to look for legislative intent. The intent is what they passed and what the president signed into law. Instead, he said judges and justices should adhere to the original meaning, not the original intent. Scalia would say, I don't care if we found some great piece of paper that shows that the founders' intent with respect to the Constitution was X or Y. They enacted the Constitution. And so we should adhere to the original meaning of these things, he said. Now, how would you find the original meaning? And the best tool for that, Scalia argued, was textualism, the actual text of the law, not something extraneous like what somebody said during a floor debate in which nobody voted upon. And for judges to come along after the Constitution, or 200 years or 50 years or 2 years or 1 year after a given statute has been passed and say, well, I see what the text says, but really it should mean this to take account of modern circumstances. That was to Scalia the imperial judiciary at work. And his whole career was about trying to get other lawyers and justices and judges to see their central task through originalism and textualism, and with it, the very modest role that the court should have. If you want to take account of nuclear weapons or the internet, you've got a Congress to help you pass new laws for that fact. You shouldn't be stretching and evolving the meaning of previous provisions and statutes to basically graft your latter-day policy preferences and sensibilities into them. One last example: if you approved of a law that President Biden signed into law last year, let's say the one enacting legal protections for same-sex marriages, would you be? How would you feel then if 10 years from now or 50 years from now, a group of unelected judges or justices could say, well, the meaning of that law can be stretched or it can be redefined somehow based on what is happening today? In essence, this robs the American people of their own liberty, and Scalia's entire career was devoted to restoring that power to the people.
And I find that really interesting, the way you explain it, because one of the problems that I have amongst today's society is that they don't look at the text. I mean, there's a reason the United States Constitution is the oldest codified constitution in the entire world. No, we're one of the youngest countries in the world. But how you have people today that try and apply 21st century standards and interpret those documents, the Constitution, with 21st century language as opposed to the language that it was written in at the time. Do you see that that's the reason why everything starts to get stretched, is because we lose the idea of language and we take the modern day definitions that exist?
Well, if we can't agree on what words mean, then we're in a lot of trouble. If we aspire to be a nation of laws being composed of words. And Scalia always took great care with all of his writings, even before he became a judge. And we've got plenty of his writings from before he became a judge in this book, Scalia: Rise to Greatness, writings from the early 70s where he predicted the internet. I mean, spot on predicted the internet and the privacy concerns that it would generate. Scalia was insistent at all points in his career that written works, whether they're written by lawyers or judges, should be understandable by a non-legal audience. And that's one of the things I've aimed to do with this book, Scalia Rise to Greatness, is make it so that you can read this book. You don't have to be a lawyer. And I predict anyone who reads it will in fact find themselves in stitches at various points because Scalia was so funny and got into such incredible situations sometimes. But he wanted not only the letter of the law to be observed, but he wanted the rulings and the discussions of it to be ones that regular folks could follow along with.
And I really always wonder, especially the last 3 years, because Scalia, I mean, listen, I have Italian descent. He has Italian descent. He's someone that I could respect that gets away. I'm not the biggest fan of the Cuomos and the Faucis of the world. Scalia is someone that I emulate as an Italian American. What do you think he would have thought of the last 3 years, particularly with all your research, I think you're the best person to ask this question. What do you think he would have thought of all the mandates coming out from governors and the recommendations and the power the CDC got over the entirety of government? What do you think he would have thought about all this?
Well, having just laid out his philosophy, which came to him from the sacred texts of Catholicism and the work and translation of his father and his reverence for original text and canons of work, he'll have to forgive me if I'm leery at this point of attributing to Antonin Scalia, who passed from the scene 7 years ago, any particular set of beliefs about latter-day personalities or events or trends, because doing so would make me as guilty of grafting my own sensibilities and today's latter-day sensibilities onto an existing body of work, which was all the things that Antonin Scalia said, did, and wrote in his time. I do go so far as to say that I think he would be, in general, dismayed by the coarseness of our political discourse. He considered himself a snoot, which is a word that refers to someone who is obsessed with words and language and usage, tricky usage questions, and anyone who was so devoted to the English language would be dismayed, I think, at the state of today's political discourse.
Yeah, I certainly would agree with that. And when we look at someone like Scalia, he was someone that was able to win people over with his arguments. He was someone that was able to influence a lot of people. Even if they disagreed with him, they still respected him.
If I can comment on that, yes. So Scalia never felt as though he was gaining much traction with this argument over originalism and textualism. Certainly, it was not a majority of the justices who ever took up that approach. Justice Clarence Thomas did, and in some ways was a more committed originalist than Scalia, which the two men would recognize with each other. But the fact is, by the time Scalia died, no less a figure than Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan, an appointee of Barack Obama. And this gets to what you were just saying, Nick, about winning people over from the other side of the divide. No less a figure than Justice Kagan said, in essence, as a result of Scalia's work trying to usher in this revolution in constitutional and statutory interpretation, that original meaning should guide us and textualism should help us find the original meaning. Kagan said, quote, "We are all originalists now."
Yeah, it really is remarkable, and it shows you what a leader he actually was and how, in a certain way, we're devoid of leadership today, which is concerning. And so I have to, putting on your White House correspondent cap, the chief White House correspondent cap, what do you make of today's press corps where, you're in the White House, you see what's going on, you see the questions that are being asked, and there's always been a liberal bent in the press. It's not something that's a secret, but today it's almost as if they're activists, a lot of it. There's very few journalists like yourself that actually go, and regardless of who's in office, ask the tough questions. What's going on there?
Well, I could take the easy way out and say, look, I'm not a media critic. I cover the White House, right, and the Biden administration, its dealings with Congress, the courts, etc. I would tell you that I have a lot of friends in the White House press corps, people I've known for years and respect. I would say that it can be too easy to make broad generalizations about any institution made up of so many individual members. Let's remember, for example, that it was the New York Times that broke the story that was probably the one most devastating to Hillary Clinton's campaign for the presidency, which was the existence of her private email server. When the documents were discovered at the Penn Biden Center, You saw the first few rows of that briefing room, which are occupied mostly by what are sometimes referred to as mainstream media outlets, asking very penetrating and persistent questions about what had happened with the Biden documents. So I do think there are some reporters out there who either haven't taken account of their own individual biases, or perhaps having taken account of them, make no effort to correct for them. But that's truly what's incumbent on a real and honest reporter, is to acknowledge that you're just like every other human being. You come to things with your own set of perspectives and biases, but that having acknowledged as much, you make sure that you're in a position to correct for them in your final product.
Yeah, and you still have to ask the tough questions, no matter what road it leads you down. You still have to ask those questions. So now that Volume 1 is out, and again, we're going to have links up at the P.A.S. report website, so everyone should check it out. When do you think Volume 2 will be coming out?
As I said, Mrs. Rosen was less than pleased to see the 2-year extension granted to Antonin Scalia and his lease on our lives. But I hope, if not before then, to be speaking with you again concerning Volume 2, which will be entitled Scalia's Supreme Court Years, 1986 to 2016, about 2+ years from now.
And just, is there something out there from your memories with him, and I'm not talking about, I know you had personal interactions, nothing off the record, but what's something that you really want everyone to take away from his life, from the rise to the Supreme Court and his life in general? What do you want the audience to take away?
I want people to read Scalia rise to greatness and believe in the American dream, because Antonin Scalia was the living embodiment of the American dream through the immigrant experience, through his Catholic faith, through his excellence in academia, and through his courage in public service, and then through his genius in the legal field. But I think you asked about my own interactions with him. The substantive discussions remain off the record. I can tell you that I got to the restaurant first. He showed up. It was the waiter only spoke broken English. He was from Italy. And Scalia looks at the menu and he says, "Pulpy, what is pulpy?" And the guy says in broken English, "Octopus." And he says, "Octopus, I'll have the pulpy." And he gives the menu. And then he turns to me for my order. And I was definitely said I wasn't going to order anything that I have to eat with my hands or anything that splashes or whatever. So and being from Staten Island myself, I said, "Veal Parmesan, please." So he's writing it down, and Justice Scalia interrupts him and says, "Give him the rabbit." And the waiter and I in unison look at the justice and say, "Rabbit?" He says, "Yeah, you're going to like the rabbit. Give him the rabbit." And the guy walked off and he brought me rabbit. And honestly, Nick, I had never had rabbit before then. I have not had it since. I had no interest in eating rabbit. And here was this larger-than-life personality, the country's foremost opponent of judicial activism, literally overruling my lunch order.
That's great. That's great. And I know I've seen my father ate rabbit. I would never touch it. I just couldn't do it. Did it taste like chicken?
You know what? It was served with something green, and I didn't know what it was, and I was having the worst visions of what it could be in relation to where it might have been on the rabbit's body, but it was already on my fork, and to maintain eye contact, it was clearly necessary in the instant moment that I was just going to have to swallow this and just keep chewing and nodding. And I did, and to this day, I don't know what that was.
Yeah, it is something where you have no choice. When the Supreme Court justice orders for you, you got to eat whatever comes. That's it.
It's an order.
Very good. James, I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to the audience. It's such a fascinating book. People need to check it out. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Nick. I appreciate it.
James is great. He's thorough in his reporting. He's got a great sense of humor. He's someone that knows the ins and outs of Washington. And as I sit here, I'm starting to think, I'm like, there's always questions that you forget to ask. That's one of the most frustrating things. And I forgot to ask him about when the Obama administration was spying on him and how the last 4 administrations spied on journalists. I should have gotten his thoughts on that, because it really is a fascinating subject. And I'll maybe the next time, hopefully it comes back on, I'll have to ask him about it, especially since he's the chief White House correspondent for Newsmax. So his insights are going to be fascinating on that question. And I'll tell you, whenever you interview someone, you always think of like a million questions afterwards, what you should have asked during the interview. It happens every single time. No matter how much you take to prep an episode, there's always things that you forget. But in any event, make sure to follow James. Check out his book, Scalia, Rise to Greatness. I have all the links up at the P.A.S. report website, pasreport.com, so check it out. As I told you, I am working on an explosive episode for Wednesday. You are not going to want to miss it. As always, share this episode with family, friends on social media. If you find the podcast informative, please give the PAS Report a 5-star rating and write a review on any podcast platform that allows it. I want to thank you for joining me, and I'll be back on Wednesday with another great episode of the PAS Report Podcast.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast.
Have a good one. Bye.
Be sure to rate, share, and subscribe to the podcast so you'll never miss an episode. Also, visit PASreport.com and follow us on Twitter at PAS Report.